This is a $100 Pokemon card, and this is the exact same card in the PSA 10. However, this card is worth $700. Now, this video will show you the best Pokemon cards you can grade in 2025 where you can make an incredible amount of profit on. Number 10 is going to be the Charizard from the Japanese set VMAX Climax. And this is honestly one of the easiest cards you can grade. If you go to a website called tcgfish.com, which is by the way completely for free, it shows you the chance of you getting a PSA 10 on this card. And by the way, I'm not sponsored by them, but it's just an awesome tool to actually find out how easy it is to grade one of your cards. This number of 92% basically means that if you would get 10 of these cards out of a booster pack and you would send all 10 of them to PSA, 9 out of 10 of these cards would probably get a PSA 10. Now usually this number is like 60-70%, but 92 is absolutely crazy. Now if you're gonna take a look at the value of this card is worth around $11, and in the PSA 10 the card goes for around $42. And honestly that's not way more expensive than the original price. But keep in mind that this card is really easy to grade. So if you do not really like to take big risks with grading, this is a really great card to grade. Because if you would buy the card for $10 and you would send it to PSA for example, and let's say the grading fee is $20, you would have to pay $30 for the card and the PSA 10 price is $40. Now a $10 profit is not really that much, I agree. However, if you decide to grade 100 of these cards, which in most cases is doable because this card is not that expensive, 10 times 100 is a $1,000 profit. So that's already way bigger. The next card that we're going to talk about is going to be the Magikarp from Paldea Evolved. Now this card is absolutely incredible because this card is probably the most expensive art rare you can find. This card goes for around $230 raw. However, in the PSA 10 it goes for over $1,800, which is almost an 8-time return of investment. Now this one is absolutely crazy. However, you are kind of taking a bigger risk by grading this card, because if you're gonna take a look at TCG Fish again, the chance of you getting a PSA 10 is actually only 23%, which is way lower than the Charizard for example, which had 92%. However, if you can manage to get this card in a PSA 10 and you can buy it for like $300 or $400 online, you'll have an incredible amount of profit. The next card is probably a card most people would not expect, but it's actually the Radiant Charizard from Pokemon Go. And this card is also an example of cheaper cards that are a little easier to grade, because this card has a 64% chance of getting a PSA 10. So again, if you would send 10 of these cards to PSA, 6 of them would probably get a PSA 10, according to these statistics of course. Now ungraded, this card is worth around $12, but in the PSA 10 it actually almost goes for $80. Now there's one extra interesting part about this card, and also a couple of other cards in this list actually have this special thing, because this card is awesome for short-term investing, because this is a card you can just buy, send it to PSA, hopefully get a PSA 10 and make a profit on. However, these kind of cards actually become more valuable over time, because even though it's a Radiant card, it's still a Charizard card. Because if you're going to take a closer look at the history of this card in a PSA 10, you can see that around 1 year ago this card went for around $45 in the PSA 10. However, today it's going for around $80, which is almost twice as much. Now there is a shot that this card next year is also worth twice as much as it is today. So if you're a bigger fan of long-term investing, you can also let this card get graded, get them back, and just put them away for around a year or two, and they probably will become even more valuable than they are today. Now the next card that also has this long-term opportunity is going to be the Ninetales from Obsidian Flames. A lot of people are a very big fan of this card, but actually this card only goes for around $17. However, this card is almost 10 times as expensive if you get it in a PSA 10, because in a PSA 10 it goes for almost $170. Unfortunately though, this card is also a little bit more difficult to grade. However, if you can manage to get a PSA 10 on this card, you not only have a very big profit in the first place, but you also have a pretty good long-term investment, because this card has a lot of potential to become more valuable in the future. Now, it's a little unfortunate that this card is so difficult to grade. However, one of these cards from this list is actually almost as expensive as this Ninetales card. However, that card is way easier to grade, but we'll get back to that in a bit. But before we continue, I just wanted to tell you that I created a free ebook you can download completely for free in the description. It teaches you all the basics you need to know about Pokemon card investing, and it's completely for free. So make sure you grab it in the description. Next up, we're not really going to talk about one specific card, but a couple of cards, because the next cards that we're going to be talking about are going to be the evolutions from Evolving Skies. Now there are actually a bunch of evolutions in Evolving Skies, but now we're going to focus as an example on the Glaceon VMAX. This card is worth around $270 ungraded, but in the PSA 10 it goes for around $500. But if you're going to take a closer look at how difficult it is to actually grade this card, you can see that it's actually pretty easy, because this card has an 80% chance at getting a PSA 10. And this is actually the case for most of the evolutions from Evolving Skies. Now, of course, the biggest hit from Evolving Skies is going to be the Umbreon VMAX. This card actually goes for around $1,200 ungraded, and in the PSA 10 it goes for almost $3,000. Now, the interesting part of this card is if you're going to take a look at the history of it, because exactly 1 year ago this card was worth around $1,275, but today it's over twice as expensive expensive as it was 1 year ago. Now, because this is also a fan favorite card and people just love the evolutions, there's a high shot that these cards will become even more valuable in the future. On number 5, we're going to take a look at the Charmander from Obsidian Flames. This card has really become valuable because ungraded this card goes for around $25, but in a PSA 10 it goes for almost $200. But remember that this card went for around $7.50 ungraded 1 year ago. So this card has really become more valuable. Now people just love the artwork of this card and people just love Charmander in general. So there's a very high shot that this card will also become more valuable. Next up, we're going to talk about a couple of cards again. For example, if we would take a look at one of the most common cards from base set, which is going to be Pidgey. A Shadowless Pidgey is worth around $2, which is not that expensive. But a Shadowless Pidgey in a PSA 10 actually goes for over $100. Now I have to agree that Shadowless cards are a little bit more difficult to grade, because it's just pretty difficult to find these kind of old cards in such great condition. However, if you can manage to find Shadowless cards which are in such great condition, you can make a lot of money by grading them. Now you can go pretty crazy with Shadowless cards and go for Shadowless Charizard, for example, but if your budget is a little bit lower, you can also just grade Shadowless common cards, like a Pidgey, for example. Now it's great that you're watching these kind of videos and that you want to learn how to make money with Pokemon cards. But if you really want to go for the next step, I recommend checking out my Pokemon card investing course in the description. It teaches you step by step how you can start investing in Pokemon cards, and you don't need any experience at all, and you can start with a budget as low as $25. If all of that sounds interesting to you, make sure to check it in the description. Now the last 3 cards are actually insane to grade, because especially the number 1 is the best card I've ever seen to grade, but I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. But first we're going to take a look at the Shiny Charizard from Shining Fates. This card is really easy to grade because Shining Fates had a pretty good print quality, because you have an 82% chance at getting a PSA 10. Now because of that, the value of the card in a PSA 10 is also a little bit lower, but it's still more than twice as much as the original value, because this card goes for around $90, but in a PSA 10 it goes for over $200. Now the reason why I put this card in the top 3 is because this card has the potential to become way more valuable in the future, because Shining Fates is actually still pretty underrated. If you're going to take a look at the set Champion's Path, for example, you can see that ETBs are gradually becoming a little bit more expensive, even though the only real chase card from the set is going to be the Rainbow Charizard VMAX. And for Shining Fates, the Charizard VMAX is probably also going to be the most expensive card. Now as soon as Shining Fates will become more valuable, the Shiny Charizard VMAX will probably also become more valuable. So this card can also be a great investment for long-term investing. Now number 2 is going to be the Charizard, Venusaur and Blastoise card from Celebrations. And I'm actually talking about the OG reprints. Now besides the fact that these cards are also just really cool, especially for people who started collecting in 1999, the print quality of Celebrations is just insane, because most of these cards are actually in great condition. If you're going to take a look at the most expensive one, which is obviously going to be the Charizard card, it goes for around $95 ungraded, and in a PSA 10 it goes for almost $300. Now the Venusaur and Blastoise are maybe a little bit more interesting if you're on a lower budget, because the Venusaur card, for example, only costs $8, which is actually pretty crazy, but in the PSA 10 it goes for around $70. Now maybe you think like this card is not that crazy to grade, right? Well, if you just look at these statistics, I get that, but you have to remember that it's really easy to get a PSA 10 on these cards, because I actually went to a convention yesterday and I found 2 of these cards which are in awesome condition, and I actually paid a little bit more for these cards because I paid $15 for this one and $12 for the Blastoise. But the thing is that these cards are just in perfect condition. Like I was trying to search for cards that had the potential to get a Black Label 10, which is really difficult, and I'm not gonna lie, these cards might actually have the potential to become a Black Label 10. Especially if you're going to grade with PSA, these cards are not really that difficult to grade. So I think that the Celebration starters are awesome cards to grade. But now we're moving on to the last card, which is the most incredible card I've ever seen to grade. And actually I already covered this card in my last video, but it's going to be the Mega Rayquaza EX from Celebrations. This card goes for around $30 ungraded, but in a PSA 10 it goes for over $225. Now that's actually a really big difference. But the thing that's special about this card in comparison to the others of this list is that it's actually really easy to grade, because this card actually has a 84% chance at getting a PSA 10. Now that's just incredible compared to the other cards, because in this video we covered a couple of cards that can get really expensive but are pretty difficult to grade. But this card, for some example, it's really expensive in a PSA 10, it's pretty cheap ungraded, and it's really easy to grade. So if you're looking for a great card to grade, you should probably go with the Mega Rayquaza EX from Celebrations. And those were the best Pokemon cards to grade in 2025. If you have any questions or something like that, make sure to drop them down in the comments. I always like to talk with you guys about these kind of subjects. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye.